It's all yours.
All right, great. Thank you very much for having me. How many people here are interested in genealogy or family history? Okay, yeah. It's got a complicated relationship with history as a profession. I've been at George Mason for forever, for 1,000 years, it feels like, and been a historian for years. And I never, well, there's a certain divide between genealogy and history. And one of the reasons I got interested in this book was trying to bridge that. I mean, people are interested in what's the meaning of their past, and historians ought to engage with that more than we tend to do. So the book is coming out in November, probably. I'll show you the cover here. I have some slides. There we go. There's the cover. Can you see that? Yes, it looks like you can.
Hmm.
Um, and it started with a fact. My father retired and got interested in family history and started researching everybody, as people do, obsessively, this is pre-internet days, traveling long distances and writing letters to alleged semi-relatives. And he discovered this interesting fact. He brought us all in for a family Christmas party. We had about 50 people there, and he had something on an easel covered with a sheet. And he unveiled the easel and said, "I hope this doesn't invalidate any of your marriages." And this was what he had gotten from the state of Virginia. And these are his great grandparents, my great great grandparents, and they're both listed as colored people. She's born in Virginia. They married in Virginia in what's now Suffolk. It was called Nansemond County at the time. It's now Suffolk. And he was born in Ireland, in Donegal, and he's also listed as colored. And this was a surprise to everybody. Partly it was a surprise that he'd ever lived in Virginia because my family was from Philly and we regarded ourselves as Philadelphians. We're part of the Philadelphia Irish American community, but also the designation is colored. And there's the couple on or about their wedding day. So that's an odd document. And they certainly don't look colored. Everyone's looking, wondering what this could mean. But there's a long history of people in Virginia being described as Black who bear no visible evidence of African ancestry. That's actually not uncommon at all. Um, there are some, oh, there they are again. There they are after they'd started a family. The guy with the big ears in the
Can,
back is my great grandfather.
we're
And
not seeing additional slides. We're still on the first one.
is that right? Oh, I'm sorry. It's
Yep.
paused. Why is it paused? How about now? Wait, how about now?
Nope.
Why is it paused? No?
Well, now I can see them. It's
Okay.
it's not full screen, but
Let me make it full screen. Try to make it full screen. I'll make it bigger. Sorry, I do this for a living. It's hard to believe, but I do this for a living. Uh, is that better?
yeah.
Okay. So there they are. This is the document that was sent to my father by the state of Virginia. And they're both listed as colored. She's born in Nansemond County, and he's born in Ireland. They're both listed as colored. Now, in the terminology of the time, colored means black. It's common to refer to people as colored, and it means by law black. You'd sometimes use the term mulatto. You see people using the term mulatto to indicate that someone is of mixed race, but a mulatto is a black person by law, and no particular um, privileges or legal specialties attached to being a mulatto in Virginia. So this makes them colored, and I think by law it makes me colored because after 1924, the law in Virginia said any person with any ascertainable trace of African ancestry is considered to be a black person. That's written into the law in 1924 and reinforced in the 1930s. And an ascertainable trace could mean appearance, but it could also mean a document, a single document. I have multiple instances of that. Anyway, there's the couple on or about their wedding day, and there's no visible evidence that they might be of African ancestry. And there they are a little later. The man in the back with the ears is my great-grandfather. Interesting to me that he has a Masonic lodge medal on his vest. He was, of course, born a Catholic, but he lived in Virginia as a Protestant. He had, it's a long story. I'll spare you all the anecdote. That's not really the point. And here's another picture of him where he looks like he might be more plausibly imagined as a person with African ancestors, but I don't think so. There are some interesting things about the document if you're a historian. And one of them is this date record filed July 1940. So if they were married in 1884, why was this record filed in 1940? And that's interesting because of, well, not this man, but this man, who some of you might have heard of, Walter Ashby Plecker. Has anybody encountered him before? You can Google him. He's quite a sinister character. He directed Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics for more than 30 years. He was the guy you wrote to for any question involving genealogy or marriage or birth records. He was a diehard eugenicist. He was completely committed to stopping racial mixing. He was obsessed with it and was determined to stop it at any cost. He was a medical doctor, a trained professional, and quite a progressive as a doctor. But he was, like a lot of people at that time, deeply committed to eugenics. This is a famous letter that he wrote to a woman in Lynchburg who had a child. And it's a good example of Plecker's work. We have a report of the birth of your child signed by Mary Gilden, midwife. She says that you are white and the father of the child is white. We have a correction to this certificate sent to us from the health department at Lynchburg, in which they say the father of this child is a Negro. This is to give you warning that this is a mulatto child and you cannot pass it off as white. A new law passed in the last legislature in 1924 says that if a child has one drop of Negro blood in it, it cannot be counted as white. You will have to do something about this matter and see that this child is not allowed to mix with white children. It cannot go to white schools, and it can never marry a white person in Virginia. It is an awful thing. Yours very truly, Walter Plecker. That's how he signs it. He did this for more than 30 years. He wrote to people consistently who he suspected were passing, or he answered queries from people who, say, the principal of a local school, who had students in his class and he had some doubts about them. Well, they look white, but maybe this one kid is a little dark. And you could write to Plecker and he would tell you their origins as near as he could tell. Here's another case where he's writing to the county clerk in Spotsylvania to tell him that there's an invalid marriage. A man of Filipino descent has married a person of Italian descent, and that law from Pittsburgh, and that law is illegal. That marriage is illegal by law. But this paragraph at the bottom is interesting. The Italians from the island of Sicily are badly mixed with former Negro slaves, and if this woman is from there, it is barely possible that she herself would have a trace of Negro blood and would be eligible for marriage to a Filipino. He does this into the 1940s. He dies, he retires and is hit by a car in 1946. But he famously boasted, Hitler's study of the Jews is not more complete than our study of the mixed races of Virginia. And I'll just briefly, if you Google him, you'll find him being accused of committing, the term is bureaucratic genocide, because he would routinely reclassify people who called themselves Indian. They would say, "Well, I'm an Indian. I'm from the Powhatan tribe. We've always been Indians." And he would say, "There are no Indians in Virginia. There are only mixed race people trying to escape segregation." And he would change the designation. And he was particularly obsessed with this problem of people who were Indian, who he just declared them black. So he kind of wiped out the genealogical record. You can find instances, I have this in the book, of him actually penciling in corrections, telling you to look on the other side of the certificate as to where he's written an account of why he thinks this genealogy is wrong. So that's why it was filed in 1940, because Plecker asked local county clerks all over Virginia to give him copies of their records so he would have centralized control of them. He's a very interesting guy. A lot of people have written about Plecker. Really quite an awful man, like just harassing people. He was often harassing the poorest and most vulnerable people. He would write to the directors of cemeteries saying, "It has come to our attention that so and so has been buried in the white section. This is to inform you that he is not a white man and you must do something about this matter." It was just a kind of hounding. People wrote to him from other states. So the gist of this is that if my family had stayed in Virginia, my father could not have legally married my mother because they
We have a
got married.
question on that. Somebody asked, is it possible that one of them listed themselves as colored so that they could marry?
It's possible that he regarded the person who did this regarded them both, one of them as colored and listed both of them as colored so they could be legally married. It's possible. It's also possible it was just a mistake. I think that's the least likely thing because the consequences of a mistake were high. I could find no evidence of African ancestry in either one of them. And of course, as one does, I've taken the DNA tests and they show no evidence of African ancestry, although it's not clear how they date that, where they begin, because of course anthropologists and archaeologists say that all of us are descended from Africans, right? The human race begins in Africa. So if you go far enough back, all of us have African ancestors. So the DNA test says no African ancestry. But that her surname, Holland, is extremely common down there. There's a little town called Holland, Virginia, and an alarming number of people are named Holland, often with the same first name, and many of them are white, many of them we would consider as black, and many of them are racially ambiguous. In fact, I'll show a picture later that I put in the book of a woman named Holland, um, and the ancestor mentioned here. But this is the guy who named them colored. His name was Peter Bowden Prentice. If you've ever been to Colonial Williamsburg, there's a Prentice General Store on the main street. He's a descendant of that family. And they applied to him for a marriage license. And on that document, filled out in their site, he listed them both as white, which you can see right there. But then he went back to his office and he filled out a state mandated registry of marriages. And on that, he listed them as colored. And you can see how he did it. There's a row called remarks, and he reserves that as he's required to do by law for describing the race of the couple. So he declared them both to be colored. This is in 1884. And then because Plecker, that's a close up, you can see this is his father and mother and her father and mother, his occupation, labor, and the minister, and their race is colored. Then in 1940, the document was copied by the county clerk and sent to Plecker. And on that one, this is interesting to me, they got, you could say, more colored, or their designation as colored became more substantial because the 1940 form required that each person's race be listed. And here they're both unambiguously listed as C for colored. And this document is the one that was used to generate the copy sent to my father. So from my perspective, what I'm getting here is race is sort of arbitrary. It's arbitrarily designated, sometimes by a county clerk, and it can become more substantial seeming over time. This is the picture I was going to show. This is a woman named, see, this is what happens when you get old. I've forgotten her first name. She's a Holland, and she's a descendant of one of the other people I write about in the book. And this is my ancestor. Now, are those people related or not? And I don't have any evidence that they are. I couldn't find any genealogical evidence that they're related. Pearlie Mae Holland is her name. And but are they related? If you were the county clerk and your job is to designate people with a race, would you see a resemblance there? Would you imagine that she's related to some other people named Holland who are black? Or would you say, no, there's no resemblance? The interesting point to me is that everybody in Virginia was required to do this kind of racial surveillance all the time, to be thinking about where to place somebody in a racial category. The other point I make in the book is that whether or not they're related by blood, they both had 6 children. They were both active members in a Protestant church. They both were constrained by the limits placed on women in that era. They were both married. They lived within a few miles of each other. They shared the same climate. They were both farm families. They both experienced the same droughts, the same heat, the same snows, the same rain. They're related socially in a very powerful sense, whether or not they're related by blood. And to me, that is an interesting point that I wanted to dramatize in the book or discuss in the book, that there's a sense of relatedness that comes from blood, and there's a sense of relatedness that comes from sociability, from chosen relations. And one of the ways I often describe that is the person I'm closest to in the world, person I share my life with, my wife, is not related to me at all. Right? The most meaningful relationship in my life is not a relationship of blood, it's a relationship of choice. It's a relationship of shared circumstance. But I don't know I don't know the answer of whether or not those two are related. I think from a historical point of view, the answer is yes, absolutely they are related. Two women, neither one of them wealthy, both of them engaged in farming, both with 6 children, both with the last surname. They absolutely must be. They're related in that sense. So the book
Now,
is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
we've got a comment and a question. One of them is that clerks make a lot of mistakes. She says her Aunt Hannah somehow became Hans, while her husband Simcha was listed as the wife
Right,
in county records.
right.
And another question is, you've talked about white and colored. What were the other choices of classification? Where do Asians fit in, for instance?
Asians were non-white. They were colored. So the example I gave, the Filipino person was regarded by Plecker as a colored person. And Indians, Asian Indians were regarded as colored people. Somebody writes to him from the University of California asking about native Indians. And he says, because if you, the history of America's racial reckoning, um, okay, most people don't know this. In 1790, Congress passed its first act about naturalized citizenship, its first statement on naturalized citizenship. And it said that naturalized citizenship is only open to free white persons. It says that by law. You could be a citizen if you were born here, but to come here and become a citizen, you had to be a free white person. But it doesn't define what white means. Does it mean skin color or does it mean something called race? And so there's a long history of state and federal cases where courts have to decide. Someone applies for citizenship and they have to decide, is this person white or not? And the most troublesome category is Middle Easterners and Asian Indians, because Asian Indians, according to theories of race, were Aryans. Northern Indians were Aryans. They were Caucasians. You go to India, you see a swastika on the side of buildings. That's an Aryan symbol, which Hitler later adopted. Asian Indians were a difficult category for a lot of Americans. There are actually 2 Supreme Court cases about this, where a Japanese man applies for citizenship in 1923. And what part of his argument is that, especially if I stay out of the sun, I'm whiter than many people normally admitted for citizenship, particularly persons of Spanish descent. And the court says, yes, you're white, but you're not Caucasian. You can't be a citizen. And then 3 weeks later, they hear the case of a man from India, Bhagat Thind, Thind, who says, yes, I'm brown, but I'm a Caucasian because I'm a Northern Indian. And the Supreme Court says, yes, you're a Caucasian, but you're not white. You can't be a citizen. It's a really interesting and complicated history. It's dangerous to ask me a question because you get a long-winded answer. I'm sorry. The simple answer is, under Plecker, certainly, people from Asia were regarded as colored, which meant not white. And it's unambiguous, as you saw in that letter that I showed before. He's not going to accept a man from the Philippines as white. He's a Malay, he calls him. And he's not going to accept any person from Asia, from the Indian subcontinent, as white. They're colored people. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, it doesn't fit. If it doesn't make sense to you, you're thinking correctly. It doesn't really make sense in the modern world. It doesn't make sense to understand race this way. It doesn't make sense to insist on the one drop rule. The book begins with the case of a man named Dempsey Hare, who was a mixed race person, and he's the richest Negro in Southern Virginia, is how he's described. He's a wealthy farmer with a lot of land. Um, his father was understood to be white, and his mother was understood to be colored, but of mixed race. And he makes national news because when he dies, he gives all of his estate to two white men named Holland and disinherits his daughter because she chose to marry a dark-skinned man. He leaves his daughter with $10, and their granddaughter is that woman I showed in the two pictures side by side. That makes national news because he wanted her to marry a white man, which wouldn't have been legal. What I found is that when they buried him, uh, I think somebody in the African American community, flipped him face down in the coffin so he would face the earth rather than the heavens. And they actually dug him up and flipped him over. And that made national news. So that's the story that the book starts with to set the racial climate of Nansemond County. Let me go back to that picture. Well, that's not what I wanted. Sorry. There. This is the picture of the woman. Her mother was disinherited because she chose to marry a darker skinned man. And by the way, if you're interested in this at all, there's a wonderful blogger on genealogy named Andre Kearns who grew up in Nansemond County, and he's the one who first alerted me to the case of this guy, Dempsey Hare. African American man, lives in Tacoma Park, writes very thoughtfully about genealogy and race. I recommend his blog very highly. I learned a lot from him.
I have a question here. Was anything ever, or could anything ever be done to correct Plecker's horrible decisions? What effect have they had on the descendants of people who were misclassified?
There was one case where a woman who regarded herself as Indian filed suit because she was denied the right to marry, and Plecker lost that. And Atha Sorrells, a woman named Atha Sorrells, from Rockland County. And Plecker was outraged about this. He was outraged. This allows the taint of inferior blood. But the judge said, my ancestors go back thousands of years. There are surely some pirates and rascals and, ne'er-do-wells in that heritage, and who can tell? And he argued that you have to affirmatively prove African ancestry to make that claim stick. I have found cases where it's one in the book where somebody marries and he's listed as white in all the documents Plecker can find except one. And Plecker insists that he's actually black and writes it in on his birth certificate and then staples a addendum to the back. And you can find pictures of that. Now, when Plecker died, the World War II and the Nazi, the Holocaust gave eugenics a bad name. And Virginia got a little less enthusiastic. Plecker became a little bit of an embarrassment. His papers were almost all destroyed after he died. The only thing that survives is about 175 letters, which are stored at UVA, and there's a small collection at the Library of Virginia in Richmond. He sent a sample of his work to a friend of his, a composer and pianist, John Powell, as a sample of his work. And those are well preserved at UVA and will probably be brought online soon. But the vast majority of his work was destroyed. I think because in his office they found it a little embarrassing, the hounding that he did and the obsessiveness. Um, I'm always hoping that more will turn up, but a lot of people have looked into Plecker and nothing more has been found so far. So
Can you
yes.
put the name of the Tacoma Park blogger in the chat?
Oh, yes. He recently wrote about discovering his German ancestors, who had owned one of his other ancestors, and going to Germany to meet his German relatives. And he found a Revolutionary War ancestor. It's quite good. He's a very, very thoughtful man, and I learned a lot from him. But I wanted the book to be more than just about my family. I wanted it to be about the larger question of how race is determined and how it's reinforced. And I think now I get again, my family never suffered any trouble from this, and none of us knew about this. We were raised thoroughly as white people, and of course, I make no claim to being anything other than what I appear to be. But if people who were us, well, did anybody ever? Dempsey Hare, the guy I was writing about, the light-skinned African American man, had a mistress who was listed as white in the census, and he had three children with her. In fact, he gave his daughter by his mistress almost the same name as the daughter he disinherited. These two women were stepsisters, and the court, in when they're assessing his inheritance, gets the two women confused, as anybody would. I think what he did is he gave his estate to two wealthy and influential local white men so that his illegitimate children could pass over into whiteness. That's my working theory, that's why he did it. That way, there was a tacit deal. We won't question or we won't call attention to the tainted heritage of your illegitimate children. And I trace those people's genealogy and they're living as white people. So that's the best explanation I can find for why he would have disinherited his daughter. But of course, no one would write that down. No one would say, I'm going to give you all my money if you allow my children to be white. It's not something you would write down. I don't know if I answered the question. There were people who would be fixed in a racial category by Plecker's actions, and that would mean segregated schools and limits on who they could marry. Maybe the most famous person to suffer under Plecker's rules is Mildred Loving, in the case of Loving versus Virginia, who some of you may know grew up regarding herself as an Indian. She lived in an area where there were a lot of people who regarded themselves as Native American. And she called herself a Native American in some documents. But when she married, she declared herself a colored person because the state of Virginia would not allow you to list yourself as an Indian. According to Plecker, no Indians existed in Virginia. I just saw Liz's comment. That is a good point. That is a really good point. And of course, it's a highly fraught question for Native peoples who have to establish an identity based in genealogy, which often means accepting categories that they historically did not accept. Most research in the Native societies suggests that they were very open to adoption of people who were not born in the local tribe, that it was quite a common practice, but they're now forced to accept the idea of blood quantum and strictly genetic definitions of Indian in place of definitions of Indian that would come from lived cultural practice. So the last part of the book is about how the documents made racial identities seem more real. And it is true about clerks making mistakes. I want to get back to that point. That's right. I found a lot of insight because it's all online now, which is fantastic. To anyone who can afford an Ancestry.com subscription, I was able to do a search for people born in Ireland between such and such a date and their racial designation. And I found several hundred instances of Irish-born people being declared to be colored. Most of them were mistakes because Ancestry.com farmed out the transcription of those documents to non-English speakers in the Far East. So there were people who would see that someone was born on the Mayo River in Southern Virginia, and they would think that that meant the person was from County Mayo in Ireland, and they would list them as Irish but black. So there are a lot of transcription errors that creep in. But I did found more than a dozen instances of people clearly being listed as born in Ireland, but also colored or black. And I wanted to know partly about that. Were Irish people really considered as racially distinct? And I think the answer is sort of sometimes. There are people who want to define, say, Jews as white but not quite white, or Italians as not quite white, or a different kind of white. You can sometimes see ethnological charts that chart the Caucasian race, and the Anglo-Saxons are up here, and the Italians are down here, and the Irish are down here, sort of. But there was never a law against intermarriage with Irish people. There were never laws formally, there were never formal segregation laws, and there are very few instances of Irish people being legally designated non-white. My great-great-grandfather is one of the few instances that I've found. And do I know why? I think that the clerk had some degree of anti-Irish prejudice. He had been arrested during the Civil War by a Irish division, an Irish American uh, battalion, I guess. I'm not sure the right designation. I'm not using the right word, and thrown in jail. So he would have remembered Irish speakers somewhat unfondly. Uh, and also, my ancestor was a farm laborer. He probably would have been browned from the sun. You might have added his Irishness and his accent to his dark color from manual labor and decided he was himself black or colored. He also was on the lam. I didn't go into this, but he had fled a marriage in Wilkes in the coal regions of Pennsylvania. He had immigrated to the coal regions. He had gotten involved somewhat in the Molly Maguires, which some of you might know about, and he may have fled that marriage and turned up in Virginia on the lam. So the clerk might have detected the odor of mendacity in him, and that made him suspect. So I don't know, but the answer is I don't know. I devoted years to this research and don't exactly know why he was declared to be colored. The point to me is how documents fabricate racial identity, how they make racial identity out of the complexity of human life. Yeah, Wikipedia. Yeah, the Black Irish is an interesting topic. There are people who always want to claim it's Spanish sailors who were shipwrecked who, married local people. It's certainly possible. I did a lot of research into English attitudes towards Ireland, and it's quite fascinating. The parallels are really clear between Irish and Native Americans. When English people are conquering Ireland, they're also settling North America, and they describe the Native Irish in very similar terms to the Indians in language like savages, uncivilized, irrational. They describe them as dark-skinned. It's very similar. It's just about othering the people you're trying to dominate. I mean, I don't think it's actually skin color. There are dark-haired Irish people and dark-eyed Irish people. That's certainly true. Ireland is as mixed as any other place. So I didn't find any evidence that the clerk who declared them to be colored had a notion of the Black Irish, and he never gave them any evidence of why he did it. I also never found any record of Plecker's actions in Nansemond County because I think those documents were destroyed. But what I go on to talk about is Ancestry.com and how they're increasingly acquiring ownership over the documents that are used to define identity. So when I looked for years to find that 1940 register where they were both listed as colored. And I went down to the Bureau of Vital Statistics in Richmond and they wouldn't let me see the original. They said the certified copy that we sent you is the same as the original. You won't learn anything. But I needed to know what that form looked like because it was different from the 1884 form. I wanted to know what had happened. They wouldn't let me see it. I actually filed a Freedom of Information request to try and get it. And the director of the Bureau of Vital Statistics wrote to me personally, and we had a phone call where he said, we're not really set up for visitors. The original is probably in the Nansemond County, the Suffolk courthouse in Southern Virginia, which was closed due to COVID at the time. So I put off finding the original, but lo and behold, there it appeared on Ancestry.com one day. The scanned photograph copy of the document that's held in Richmond. So I was able to use that, but I asked to get permission to reproduce it in the book, I wrote to the director of the Bureau of Vital Statistics and I said, "Can I have permission to use this?" And he said, "Well, to be honest, I don't know if we own the rights. I think Ancestry.com owns the rights." So Ancestry.com digitizes, they entered into an agreement in 2015 with the state of Virginia to digitize those documents. And in return, Ancestry got the right to display them for a subscription. And the taxpayers of Virginia got the right to view them at a terminal at the Library of Virginia. So effectively, Ancestry.com is acquiring de facto ownership of these original documents, which is an interesting fact, given how powerful those documents have been in the past in defining people's racial identity. And you can find similar things if you go to the Library of Congress. You probably know this. I mean, to the National Archives website, if you're a genealogist and you want to see the census records, you can see them if you go there in person. But the website directs you to Ancestry.com because those records were digitized by volunteers working for Ancestry.com and the Latter-day Saints. So that one of the chapters in the book is about the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, and their particular interest in genealogy and the work they do transcribing. The thing that worries me the most is that Ancestry not only has de facto ownership of state genealogical records, it's also linked them to a database of DNA. So they've got a really unchecked authority over identity. And if you look at the history of someone like Walter Plecker, it has to make you nervous about what can be done with those records. And so far, Ancestry.com is relatively benign, and it's entertaining to take those tests and find out your ancestry, and millions of people do it. They regard themselves as far more a biotech company than they do a genealogy company. Genealogy is a tiny fraction of their business compared to the DNA database, which is geometrically more valuable than the DNA database part. So the last bit of the book is about that shifting relationship. And on the one hand, we get access, but the access is only for subscribers. I want to teach about this in the fall, but I would have to require my students to buy a subscription to Ancestry.com, which a lot of them can't afford. So I'm trying to figure out ways around that problem. That's a good question about the census takers. Um, the census, they're usually the returns, the census taker is listed at the top and they're in different handwriting and they describe where they're going. So I think we can generally know that it's done in person. But I mean, I have a case where there's a woman who dies in Philadelphia and she's born in Galway in Ireland. She dies in 1946 in Philadelphia and her place of birth is listed as Galway and her race is listed as Black. And this is in 1946. What was going on there? And the answer, it turned out, is that she had married a Black man or a mixed race person. And the doctor concluded that that made her a Black person. Yeah, okay, good. The Virginia room, that's good that they have it. I mean, I think it's not, my only concern about it is that we should be wary of who gets ownership of those documents. I know that if you work for the Bureau of Vital Statistics, you don't look at the original documents anymore. You go to Ancestry.com and you look it up from Ancestry.com. And this is from students who worked for the Bureau of Vital Statistics. They don't go to those documents anymore. So the original documents are filed away. They're expensive to store. They're costly to get access to. Why do it? Eventually, they'll probably just eliminate them. Or they'll make them consistently more and more inaccessible. That seems like an inevitability. And then you'll have de facto ownership by Ancestry.com. You can, it's a mixed bag. It is a wonderful thing. A lot of the research for this book I did sitting on a couch looking at Ancestry.com because I didn't have to go to the archives because it's all online. They're also, from a historian's point of view, they're very inconsistent in what data they give you. They don't always tell you the race of the person, even if race was on the original form, for example. So the larger argument here is really, it's a plea for asking people who love family history to also love history. You know, the historian's critique, history is supposed to have an argument. It's not just supposed to be a chain of facts. It's supposed to be an argument about what those facts mean. And genealogists often present facts, one argument, and it is this. This person is related to me, and this person is related to me, and this person is related to me, and this person is related to me. And that's not a good historical argument. It's not could it be fleshed out a little more? That's, I guess, the book is partly a plea that genealogists and historians talk more to each other and genealogists engage in a deeper sense of the context of what they're finding. So that's the basic outline of the book. It ends with a case in 2019 when three couples in Virginia went to get married, and the requirement for a marriage license, getting a marriage license required that you list a race for yourself. You had to give a race. And all three couples refused to do it, which meant they couldn't legally get married. And they filed a lawsuit. Why do we have to list a race? It's interesting because all of them were modern people. They were often the products of immigration from all over the world. One woman was Asian Indian from Guyana, right? See, some of the white people didn't want to be listed as white. They wanted to be listed as Scottish and French. Um, some people were of mixed race, but didn't want to insist on the categories provided, and they didn't want to call themselves other. You've all filled out that form, right? Where there's a pull down, Asian Pacific Islander, Hispanic, non-white, and you have to choose. And other is one of the categories. Why should I be other? That's really interesting about the one having it. So the court, the judge, who was a Trump appointee and a conservative African American, concluded that it was unconstitutional to require people to list a race when they got married. And so that the problem is the software wouldn't let you even complete the form unless you chose a race. And so that requirement has been stricken. So now you don't have to list a race. And I thought that, to me, it was extremely interesting historically, because I want the information on how people were treated in racial terms. I want that information. And I think a society committed to fairness needs to know if one sector of its population is being treated unfairly. I should look at some questions. Right. And one comebacks with African descent and whether did not. That seems entirely plausible. Ancestry is a little. Ancestry lists me as 94% Irish, but the question is starting when, right? Is that Irish starting in the St. Patrick's Day? Is it Irish starting in the Neolithic era? Is it after the Norman conquest? Is it Irish referring to a geographical designation where certain haplotypes are found? What exactly do they mean by that? And it's many people who've written about this have pointed out that it imagines a kind of purity to national origins that they don't really have. It makes a kind of racial claim for natural origins. And they're imprecise about where they're drawing the line. I'm supposed to have some Danish ancestry, but it's unclear where that was. It the Vikings? I don't know when that allegedly got in there, or how much. They're very vague about that. It's fun to see, look at the little pie chart, and I'm not necessarily being critical of it. I'm not dismissing it. It's useful and meaningful, and certainly for many people, particularly for African Americans, for whom slavery wiped out the record of their ancestors, DNA evidence is often the only evidence they're going to get. But it's a mixed bag because you're using DNA evidence. Well, finally, this is Walter Plecker. Many people wrote to Walter Plecker saying, isn't there some kind of blood test I can use to determine who's black? I got these kids in my school, and one of them looks black and the others don't. Isn't there a blood test? And Plecker would say, sadly, no. There is no blood test for determining race. We must rely on genealogical records. And of course, now there is. Now there is the test that Plecker dreamed of. And that is something that we ought to examine critically, at a minimum, examine critically. Do I have any recommends for?
One
Yes, I'm sorry.
one thing I've read about results from places like Ancestry is any genetic makeup that comes back in single digits, you're 4% Danish and 3%
It's
French, is just
arbitrary.
noise. It's just
Yeah,
noise. And
right.
you can't, it's not telling you anything useful.
Well, there's so many interesting things about there's the DNA. They used to call it junk DNA. Most of the DNA on our chromosomes doesn't code for anything as far as we know. We don't know what it does. And a lot of the information about ethnicity comes from that segment of the DNA, which is non-coding. They call it non-coding DNA. So it might show you as X percentage Danish, but it's not clear it's actually doing anything. It's sitting there, but it's not clear what it's doing to you or for you. And then it's it's also interesting which one you're which one you're following. I only followed one ancestor on the paternal line. I could have found a lot of interesting things by going the other way. And at a certain point, relatedness becomes so diluted that you're related to everyone. And to me, that's where history comes in. I like to feel that I am related to everyone in Arlington in some way, not necessarily by blood, but by the fact that we share a political ecosystem, we share an environment, we share a set of concerns, we share a set of conflicts. That's a form of relatedness. And it's often frustrating to me that genealogy doesn't make room for things like a mentor you really cared about, a foster parent. It has a very hard time accounting for adopted people who, in some way, it wants to say, no, no, your birth mother is your real mother. Your adoptive parents are not. It tends to want to discount social relations in favor of quote unquote blood relations. And I think when I look at the history of Virginia's racial regime, that makes me nervous too. Um, yeah, they've dropped that altogether. Do I have any recommend for genealogists? I would actually look at this man, Andre Kearns, a very smart man, a very gracious man who writes really intelligently about doing family history. He's focused significantly on African American family history, but of course he finds out that his own family history is not just African American; it's also Euro American, and so he's very interested in the questions that raises. And I would recommend his blog very strongly. He's a great guy. Oh, I haven't seen that PBS show, The Burrow. No, I haven't seen that. I have looked into this, and it is very difficult to know who Irish people are, quote unquote, racially, because you go to the Ren Fair and they're selling you Celtic stuff and Celtic hoodoo, and it's not really clear Celts were ever a people in the sense of being a tribe. It was a language and it was a cultural group. But to describe Celts as a unitary population is like saying people in the Philippines who speak English are the same as Americans, or people who speak English in Australia are the same as Americans, or in the Virgin Islands or Jamaica. That English is a language group. It's not anything like a race, but Celt is used as a race. So I'm not sure about, as far as I've been able to determine on the origins of Irish people, it's very mixed like everybody else. It's not there are lots of people who want it to be some kind of test of purity, but as far as I can tell, it's very mixed. I think that the argument about there being Spanish sailors is easily debunked by the fact that the British were offering really substantial bounties for the capture of any Spanish sailor who washed ashore on Ireland because they were worried about the Spanish as potential invaders. So if you were a poor Irish person and a Spanish sailor washed up on shore, your first impulse would be to turn him in and collect that bounty. It's not clear to me how many people actually would have settled in as members of the community. I think there are also several really good books. There's a wonderful book by a woman named Sadia Hartman. It's called Lose Your Mother. And she's a scholar, she's a lit scholar, and she goes back to Ghana to discover the roots of her ancestors in Ghana. And she's a great, very, very smart woman. And it's a humorous book. She's got a sense of humor about herself. But she goes back to Ghana to find her roots, and she finds that the people she meets in Ghana were very complicit in the slave trade and they're not eager to embrace this American who wants to remind them of their complicity in the slave trade. And they also don't regard her as African; they regard her as an American. And she processes those things in a very thoughtful and entertaining way. It's quite a good book. And then a book I used a lot and recommend, although it's not easy, is a book called Racecraft by Barbara Fields. You might remember Barbara Fields if you saw Ken Burns' Civil War documentary. She's an African American historian. She was young at that time. She teaches at Columbia. And she argues that really we should stop using the term black or white, and we should get in the habit of saying has ancestors from Africa and France, or has ancestors from Ghana and Morocco, or ancestors from Norway and Senegal. That we should get in the habit of using has ancestors from rather than is. has ancestors from Vietnam and India rather than is Asian. She thinks that that would free us from always rewriting the history of the sort of racial nonsense that I'm describing in the case of my ancestors and Walter Plecker. We're always reinscribing these arbitrary racial categories. And she says we can do that while also acknowledging our own personal heritage, our own personal history, and finding the meaning of that history. And I've had a lot of good discussions in class about those essays and that argument, because it's very hard to let go of racial designations. They're baked into American culture. She uses the term racecraft because she compares it to witchcraft. And if you believe in a society, if you're in a society that believes in witches, you're always trying to prove that something happened because of a witch. And my cow died because that woman is a witch and she cursed the cow. And in those societies, being a witch is never outwardly visible. It's a secret concealed in the blood. And she says race is like that. If you believe in race, you're always ascribing something to race. Those people are poor because of their race. Those people are violent because of their race. That's racecraft at work. If you would say that person has ancestors from these places, you would have a more nuanced account of their rich and complex history. It's quite an interesting set of essays written with her sister called Racecraft. Yes, Liz, I think it's confusion about language. It's mistakes language for race, which Fields would call an example of racecraft. So for a lot of the book, I was trying to write about people without using the term black or white, which is extremely difficult to do. So I would say Dempsey Hare had ancestors from Africa and Europe and just describe them that way. Or so-and-so was known to have African ancestors rather than saying so-and-so was black, because then I would be repeating the work of Walter Plecker, which I didn't really want to do. It was a fascinating, it took me 20 years to figure out how to write this book. It was a real struggle, but I hope it came out okay. We'll find out in November. If there are any other books that I could recommend.
Michael, I was going to ask you, I'm assuming that this was a very specialized kind of activity for you in connection with your family. I had put a question in the chat regarding whether you think that people who are just
Oh,
amateur exploring about their, families, would they have found things like this? And are there genealogists maybe who can help people do
it,
this?
the genealogical record online is so extensive now. If you don't want to subscribe to Ancestry.com, my wife is continually saying, "Can we cancel that Ancestry subscription now?" And I said, "Not till the book comes out." But the FamilySearch.org, which is run by the Latter-day Saints, is free. It doesn't have everything Ancestry has, but it has most of it. And all you have to do is register with them, and then you have access to a really extraordinary range. Now, Ancestry is marvelous because it also has newspapers.com, which lets you search for the context of your ancestors. I'm going to teach a course about this in the fall for students interested in family history. And my goal is to try and get them to contextualize their family history. And that's particularly true for students, say, I have a student from Pakistan who's going to take the course, and she said, "I just won't be able to find much." And I said, "Well, that's fine. What you can do is contextualize the experience of what you can find." What did it help? How did it help me to be a professional historian? I mean, I have a big context for Reconstruction and I have a professional context for American history, and that was helpful. But a lot of I would just, the important thing is to ask why. Why did this ancestor do this? And then you can find books that are about that topic, and you can find ways to enrich the meaning of those ancestors' choices. And I just want to make a plea that people try to do that. I think it's a better way to find the meaning of our own past, which of course is anybody who's interested in family history, they feel a deep need to locate the meaning of their past. And I think history is one of the ways to do that. And genealogy is typically more narrow than history in that it focuses only on blood relations. Blood relations in my book are an anchor for context, for larger context. Did I answer that question? I didn't really answer that question very well, did I?
Well, the only reason I was asking also is as I said, I produce a podcast, and it just occurred to me that I haven't had anybody talk about genealogy, the basics, and how to get started, what to
Yeah.
do, who to contact, this kind of thing. And I wasn't sure, quite frankly, you were the right person. Although if you were, that would be great.
Yeah.
We can talk later offline
Sure.
here, but I just think there are people out there. And then I did see that I think Liz, you put something in. I didn't know if there's anyone in Arlington that I could contact who I could interview on a show about how to get started in genealogy or what to know and, resources and this kind of thing.
We
So
There
that
we
would be
absolutely
actually
are.
had a coffee and conversation a while back from somebody, and that was exactly what she talked about.
Oh, okay.
So I will look through and see if I've got the name, and if I don't, I'm sure Mary does, and so we'll get
Perfect.
that to you.
Great.
There's a
Thank you, Gary.
there's a wonderful book now. I think it's out of print by Richard White, who's a very eminent historian, mostly of the West. And it's
Mhm.
called Remembering a Hanagram, and it's about his mother who was born in Ireland, and she told him all sorts of fantastic stories about Ireland, most of which he finds out were not really true. And it's about what he does with that. How does he weigh the meaning of family stories as opposed to the meaning of historical fact? He does it very gracefully, trying to sort those two things out because family stories are fantastic. And I relied on them in the book, but fact checked them whenever I could. And sometimes I was left with only the family story. And how plausible is this? I talk a little bit about how plausible that is.
Mhm.
Uh, they are fantastic. And about students, are most of the students aware of the background? I think students are very typically at a stage in life where they want to free themselves from their background. And so they're not that interested. And I will say right away, like I don't think anybody has to care about their family history. It's not a if you don't care, don't care. I don't think it's a compulsion. But
Right.
millions of people find it a source of meaning. And history should engage with that. And it should
Yeah, and
engage.
I think as they get older, I think there's even more of a tendency to do that. And so, but some people don't know exactly how to get started. So I appreciate Gary, you checking that out, and getting back to me on that because
Hmm.
I would be interested in that.
The
So
comment
any,
from Sue Mosher is I did a lot of trips to Ireland as research.
okay,
And like I tried to find these ancestors in the landlord records of their landlord. So I'm looking through old dusty records of collecting rent. And I didn't find much. Ireland is a particularly tough place, not good records in Northern Ireland.
hmm,
Um, I had an itch. So for another book, I started teaching myself to play Irish music, Irish traditional folk music on the flute, and I go to sessions in DC. And I was over there and I was exploring the ancestral bog, and I was talking to people in this community, some of whom had the same name as my ancestor, and asking where they might be from. And the Irish people are very patient with this sort of thing. But another American looking for his roots, that they get that all the time and they're sort of bored with it. But I went to a local pub and I sat down and there were people playing this kind of music and I had the flute with me. So I started playing and they were very, very welcoming. What mattered is
nice,
not that I had Irish ancestors. What mattered is that I had put in the time to learn the culture. And
nice,
if genetics mattered, I'd be a much better flute player than I am. But if genetics doesn't matter, practice matters. So I think of understanding your roots as kind of practicing your practicing your heritage or practicing your history
right.
rather than
Good
rather
advice.
than claiming a kind of genetic entitlement.
Good advice.
But travel is great. I mean, it was a very useful way to bring the place you're at a little more alive, to think about were they here and what did they do if they were here.
Well, with a with a last name like Beversdorf, I guess I'll have to plan a trip to Germany
You're
and
heading for Germany, right?
see what I can find there. So, well, it looks like we're past 11 o'clock, which is our closing time. So, Michael, thank you so much. This was a great presentation, and it looks like based on the comments in there, lots of people learned a lot about you and your book, and we
It
wish
was a
you
little too
well.
me focused. I'm sorry.
We wish you well in terms of your research and the next book that you will be doing. So
Thank you very much. I
thank you.
put my email in there if anybody has any questions about this or if I could be useful in any way.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Thank you very
Well,
much.
and
Thank
next
you.
week we will be learning about estate planning strategies. Jennifer Schiffer with Bean, Kinney, and Corman will be talking about what you need to know, ins and outs of estate planning, and she's an expert legal from an expert legal perspective. So sounds like a very informative program that we'll all learn something about as well, just as we did today. So have a good week, everybody, and we'll see you next Wednesday at 10 o'clock.
Bye.